supposed to be just a few days. It was supposed to be just a few days. My mom told me it would just be a few days. And yet what was supposed to be just a few days have become a couple decades. 20 years of struggle, 20 years of struggling under the hot sun every day, of fighting to stay warm in the cold at night, 20 years of being deceived, 20 years of fighting with my father-in-law, 20 years of family strife between me and my wives, 20 years since God spoke to me in that place in the middle of nowhere. And he came to me when I had nothing, and he promised to me that he would build me into a great nation, and that he would be with me, and he would protect me, and he would bring me back home. 20 years since, after hearing that promise, that I then made a vow to this God. God, if you do these promises, then you will be my God. But up until now, I still haven't made my way back home. And so while this God may be the God of my grandpa Abraham and the God of my father Isaac, he is still not my God. The jury is still out on whether or not my descendants will know this God as the God of Jacob. Good morning, everybody. My name is Pete, and I'm one of the pastors here. Welcome if you're watching online. You're joining us for week 2 of a series that we're calling Jacob, Wrestling with Family, Destiny, and God. And last week, we started Jacob's story. And if you weren't here, just a quick refresher, maybe catch you up. Jacob is the second born of twins who God chooses to bless and pass on the family promise to, which is a subversion of the cultural norm, because normally the firstborn gets the blessing, gets the birthright, is the most important, and God flips this. But Jacob doesn't wait for God to do it. He runs ahead, and he becomes a trickster figure. He tricks his dad into giving him the birthright, or he tricks his brother into giving him the birthright, then he tricks his dad into giving him the blessing. And all of this makes his brother Esau angry enough to want to kill him. And so Jacob's mom comes to him and says, why don't you just go away for a few days to our family in Haran, in the region of Padam Aram. And while you're there, you just go for a few days, and your brother, he'll simmer down, and then you can come back. And so Jacob leaves for this place with seemingly nothing but some vague promise that his mother told him. And God meets him as he's on his way there in the middle of nowhere and reaffirms these promises to Jacob. I will be with you. I will protect you. I will make your descendants as numerous as the dust of the earth, and I will bring you back home. But 20 years later, Jacob's still not back home. What was supposed to be days turned into decades. And this morning what we're going to do is talk about those decades. 2 decades, 20 years that Jacob spends away from home. It's found in Genesis chapters 29, 30, and 31. And we're not going to read all of that this morning. I'm going to go through it, and I hope that you will go home and read it after maybe taking some of the things that I share this morning. But we're going to look at those 20 years, and here's, if you want to know, like the outline in my head. I have it broken down into 7 years, 7 years, 6 years. 7, 7, 6. So in my head right now, it's 7, 7, 6, application, lunch. That's what I got in my head right now. And it's not perfectly, doesn't work out in the 776. Like everyone that interprets this passage doesn't come up with those same exact things. There's some debate, but it's pretty clear. It's kind of like the majority would go with a breakdown of 776. And so before we get to the first 7 years, though, let me give you a little bit of a preface that we're in the middle of Jacob's story, and this is the sermon that I was most worried would be boring. Ha 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 ha. It's okay. Because I knew that the first one, it's the beginning, there's a dream, and I know what's coming next week. You're going to love it. But this week, I'm like, this is such a weird 20 years. It's like if you've ever read the Bible before, especially the Old Testament, it's full of those weird stories. Like the weird stories where stuff's happening and you're like, is God even here? Like God is silent. The narrator doesn't even tell you what God is thinking or doing. There's just weird stuff happening. And you get done reading it and you go, how do I apply that to my life? What am I supposed to do with this? That's kind of what these 20 years feel like. And yet let me submit to you that it is in this strangeness of the Old Testament stories that the Bible finds its rootedness in humanity. That the Bible is not a clean story that fell from the sky about perfect people who walk in a nice linear line following God. No, it's messy. It's like the Bible more like rises up from the dirt, because that's where God meets us, in the dirt, in the mud. And he begins to work with that dust, with that dirt, with that mud, and he breathes new life into it. But because of that, we find sometimes stories about like normal, average people doing messed up things, having weird lives. And we have to read that and go, okay, there's something for me here. And there's something so real and authentic about these stories. But you have to work a little bit harder to get something out of them. And so if you'll bear with me as we walk through these 20 years, I think that these 20 years have something for us. It just takes a little bit more to get to it. This is why, by the way, Jesus teaches in what are the two main ways that Jesus teaches? He tells stories, he uses illustrations, and he asks questions. Because he's less interested in telling you what to do like a commander and more interested in painting a picture of the world that he invites you to freely participate in. And that's what I think we find in the narrative stories of the Bible. So with that, here we go. First 7 years, Jacob is on the run. He gets to his family. He gets to his mom's brother's family. His mom's brother's name is Laban. And he gets welcomed there. There's a little story about his welcoming there and some interactions. And he's there for about a month working as a shepherd. And that's where we're going to pick up the story in Genesis chapter 29. Maybe. This is where I'm like, I don't have a Bible. I don't have a Bible, guys. Okay, here we go. Laban said to him, just because you are a relative of mine, should you work for me for nothing? Tell me what your wages should be. Now, Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah had, I think I said Leah. I don't know. Leah? It's Leah. Yeah, Leah. Leah had weak eyes, but Rachel had a lovely figure and was beautiful. What's going on here? The most we could say about Leah is weak eyes. Did anybody else find that during COVID when everyone was wearing masks, everyone looked way more attractive? Like everybody has beautiful eyes, right? So she had like her eyes weren't so bad to look at, but like you take off that COVID mask, put the mask back on. But Rachel had a lovely figure and it seems like we're making a comparison here. Woo, somebody single in the house. Anyway, it was beautiful. This clicker seems to be betraying me, guys. So if you want to, I will touch the screen. Acts like it's controlled that way. Jacob was in love with Rachel. Of course he was. And he says to Laban, I'll work for you 7 years in return for your younger daughter, Rachel. And Laban said, it's better that I give her to you than to some other man. Stay here with me. And so Jacob served 7 years to get Rachel. But they seemed like only a few days to him because of his love for, somebody else is single. Get those two people together. If I could find a man who could work for 7, it'll just be like, so romantic. Then Jacob said to Laban, give me my wife. My time is completed, and I want to make love to her. Bible? It's so direct. What happened to when we used to just say, and he wanted to know her? Remember that? We just wanted, okay. So Laban brought together all the people of the place, and he gave a feast. But when evening came, he took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob. and Jacob made love to her. Wait a second. He was waiting for Rachel. And Laban brings Leah. Now, how does that work out? I don't know. Maybe there's like a really big veil. They don't have electricity. It's dark. But somehow, Laban tricks him, and Jacob makes love to Leah. And Laban gave his servant Zilpah to his daughter as her attendant. And when morning came, Jacob woke up. Oh, there was Leah. And so Jacob said to Laban, "What is this you've done to me? I served you for Rachel, didn't I? Why have you deceived me?" Well, that's an interesting piece of the narrative. He's not being told, we're not being told what God is up to here. And yet the narrator has this little line on Jacob. The deceiver has suddenly been deceived. That's something. Laban replied, "It is not our custom here to give the younger daughter in marriage before the older one." It is not our custom. What do you think Jacob is feeling? Remember Jacob, the younger born, who gets unjustly treated as lower just because he came out like right after his brother. He goes to a new place, a fresh start. Let's get away from those weird customs and cultural norms. And he gets to this new place, and what has followed him? These weird customs. You got to be kidding me. It's our custom. I worked for 7 years. And I'm still being tricked and being held down by these weird customs of our people. Man, just imagine what it was like when this wording was said to Jacob. Finish this daughter's bridal week, then we'll give you the younger one also, in return for another 7 years of work. And Jacob did so. He finished the week with Leah, and then Laban gave him his daughter Rachel to be his wife. And Laban gave his servant Bilhah to his daughter Rachel as her attendant. And Jacob made love to Rachel also, and his love for Rachel was greater than his love for Leah. And he worked for Laban another 7 years. His love. Remember last week? Last week we heard about a family where the father loved one of the sons more and the mother loved one of the sons more. We came from a family that had favoritism basically destroy the family and lead to one brother wanting to kill the other. And Jacob goes from that dysfunctional family and he begins to start a new family where that dysfunction follows him. And all from the beginning, he loves Rachel and Leah, who I'm going to mess up her name all morning. Don't worry about it. Not so much. This is the first 7 years. I know that they mentioned the second 7 years, but we're going to talk about that in a second. The first 7 years here, he works and he acquires these 2 wives. And you're left after reading this section of the story, you go, so what do I do with that? God does not speak in this section. The narrator does not tell us what God is thinking or doing in this section. And so you read all that's happening and you're just left to interpret on your own. And so you pick up things like, well, is this like karma? Is this like a karmic kind of thing? Not in the sense that like karma is a real force or has any sort of personality, but the deceiver has become the deceived. Did God do that? Was God happy to see that Jacob's getting a taste of his own medicine? I don't know, but it's there. It's there for us to see. It's there for us to think, do I experience that in life? Sometimes my mistakes come back in full circle. I experience them in a fresh way. That life can be like that. I know what Jacob would be feeling in that moment. But how about at the most basic level, we just make this observation. That Jacob, who began as a fugitive with just a promise, now has 2 wives. Did God want him to have 2 wives? It doesn't say. Are those the right 2? Should he have just had 1? Were there other women that he should? I don't know, but we went from a guy with just a promise in his back pocket about a God who he doesn't really know much about. All I know is my mom told me something. This God showed up to me one time and he made me this promise that he made the same promise to my grandpa Abraham and my dad Isaac. That's all I got. And now I got 2 wives. huh. It's the first 7 years. Second 7 years, as he works for Laban to earn his second wife, Rachel, but he has both wives, he begins to have children. And you find this section in Genesis chapters 29 to the end of 29, 31 to 30, 24. And let me just tell you, let me just show you a picture of what it's like in his home as children enter in. He has one wife that he loves, Rachel, one wife that he doesn't, Leah. And Leah begins to have sons. Leah has 4 sons. And the first 3, after each one, having sons should be like, this is so great, like God is doing it. My nation is beginning. And yet there is a deep sadness attached to each one of these births, as Leah says after each one, maybe now my husband will love me. God has blessed me. Maybe now he will see me. Maybe now he will be attached to me because we have had sons together. And by the 4th son that is born, she gives up on this hope and simply praises God. Thank you, God, for another blessing in my life. But it's like she's given up on the idea that her husband would love her. While all this is happening, Rachel cannot have children. And so she becomes very jealous. Imagine what that's like in this house. Maybe 3 to 4 years having 4 children, and each time Rachel has to see this all play out. And it says she becomes so jealous, and she says to Jacob, I can't take this. I would rather die. If I can't have children, I'd rather die. And then Jacob says to her, who am I, God? I can't make this happen. And it's this little insight. If this was like a reality TV show, this would be like that awkward moment when the cameraman is like picking up a fight and you're like, ooh, this is interesting, but also it would be weird to be there. Like they're like yelling at each other. I'd rather die. Who am I, God? I'm not in control of these things. So Rachel says, well, then take my servant. Maybe through my servant, God will give me some sons. And so she gives her servant Bilhah, who has 2 sons. And then Leah, who realizes that she's not having sons anymore, or children, says, here, take my servant, and maybe I'll have some sons. And so she has 2 more sons. And by the way, each of these names have a meaning to them that you can look up, and each time that they're born, the women go around saying things like, God has blessed me. I'm so fortunate. Asher means happy, and so when Asher's born, oh, I'm so happy. I'm just so happy that I have enough, it reminds me of like what people would tweet or like put on social media, like the little digs of like, my life is better than yours. Like the women after each birth are like, look at this, number 6 for me. What are you on? Oh, just 2 from your servant girl. Whatever. I'm so happy and blessed. Like the strife and the animosity in this home is growing. And so her servant has 2. Then Leah and Rachel make a deal over some mandrakes, which is you could do a whole other sermon on this. They make a deal, and so Rachel says that Leah can go back in to Jacob, and then she has 2 more sons. After which, finally, it says that God remembers Rachel, and Rachel has a son. I present to you the biblical family. What a mess. Oh my goodness. Okay, first of all, do any of these women even want to be with Jacob? I don't know. They're basically treated like property. So let's begin there. Leah just given to oh man, I got to have child after child. These 2 are servants. They're just like ushered in, go pump out some What is Leah and Rachel hate each other, like they're fighting with each other. And Jacob's he's just kind of silent through this whole thing. And once again, God does not speak to Jacob. There's a couple narrative points where it says that God sees and he hears, he remembers, and he's active, but he does not speak to Jacob. So you're left with this and you go, what, Bible, why are you telling me this? Why didn't we just go like, hey, Jacob got a wife named Rachel, and they had a boy named Joseph, and then go Joseph with his technicolor coat, right? Let's move on the narrative. Why do we need to know all this? It's so messed up. And yet, once again, perhaps we are meant to see the God who holds the future gently making his promises come true. The man who was a fugitive with just a promise in his back pocket had 2 wives, and now he has 11 sons. Did God want it to look like this? No comment. Not by me. No comment by the narrator. No comment by God. But it's happening. Interesting. After this, we've had 7 years. 7 years of kids. Then we get 6 years. At the beginning of which, Jacob says to Laban, I have worked for you for 14 years. I have earned my wives. Now I would like to go back home. And Laban's like, wait. You've made me very rich. You're a very good shepherd. I can't lose you. You've been increasing our family. This family's growing. I want you to stay. And so they begin to make a little deal with each other that will have Jacob stay for another 6 years. And this is what it sounds like. Laban says, what shall I give you, he asked, to make you stay? Don't give me anything, Jacob replied. But if you'll do this one thing for me, I will go on tending your flocks and watching over them. Let me go through all your flocks today and remove from them every speckled or spotted sheep, every dark-colored lamb, and every spotted or speckled goat. They will be my wages. And my honesty will testify for me in the future. Whenever you check on the wages that you have paid me, any goat in my possession that is not speckled or spotted, or any lamb that is not dark-colored, will be considered stolen. Agreed, said Laban. Let it be as you have said. And if you go and read the account here, you realize that Jacob's got like a trick up his sleeve. And it later becomes clear that God told him how to do this and that God was orchestrating this. But basically, Jacob knew all along that there would be many spotted, speckled, dark-colored sheep and goats, and that his flocks would multiply at an alarming rate. And so this happens. And by the end of this part of the story, by the time we get to verse 43, the narrator tells us this. In this way, the man, Jacob, grew exceedingly prosperous and came to own large flocks and female and male servants and camels and donkeys. Again, this part of the narrative, no commentary from the narrator about what God is doing or how he's operating. And God does not speak to Jacob. And yet, the man who was a fugitive with just a promise in his back pocket had 2 wives, then 2 maidservants, then 11 sons, and now he has been made exceedingly prosperous. It seems like God has been gently making this promise come true. The only thing left is for Jacob to return home. And so at the beginning of chapter 31, God finally speaks. The Lord said to Jacob, go back to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be with you. And if you go and read chapter 31, you'll then see that he plans to leave, and we're told these little details about how God has actually been appearing to Jacob in the form of dreams, and he told him about how this whole flock scenario would work out. But then Laban pursues him, and eventually they have to make a peace treaty. They have to make this interesting peace treaty that you're like, why is the Bible telling me this? But you could look at it this way, that Laban, who represents like the people, this whole big people group, has come out to Jacob, who started off with nothing. And he now barters with him, making a peace agreement with him, as if Jacob is his own nation. And they set up a rock, and they're like, our nation will only come this far, your nation will go this far. Wait, this guy like 20 years ago had nothing, and now suddenly we treat him like he's his own nation. Interesting. And then Jacob heads on home, which is where we'll pick up the narrative next week. And so for now, the rest of this morning, I want to ask the question, so what do we do with this story? It's so messy. It's so messy, and there's so little commentary from God about what to do with this story. And so let me remind you this first thing. This is the beginning of the Bible. This is the beginning of these people's interaction with the God of the Bible. They don't know what to expect. They don't know who this God is. And so they're beginning to learn little pieces about what this God is like. And so here's maybe some of the things that we could glean, some of the things that they are learning throughout this narrative. Number one, this God is not in a rush. This God is not in a rush. He will take his time. Blessing, I will appear to you, and then I will go dark for many years. Maybe it's because this is how he teaches us to trust in him. Because if he said, I'm going to bless you, and the next day Jacob woke up and he had everything that God promised, would he have had to grow at all? Would he have had to learn to trust at all? No. And so I've heard it said this way, that it is in the gaps that we grow. It's in the gaps in between the promise and the fulfillment. That's where virtue is built. Maybe that's what we're supposed to see in this story. Can you ride along in these chapters where God is quiet? Ride along with Jacob and ask yourself, what was it like? What was it like to live there? To be deceived by your uncle, to have fighting women in your home, to be wondering, like, will I ever get back? To wonder about who God is. Can you ride along with Jacob through this story of the God who is not in a rush? How about this? I alluded to this last week. God can work through the mess. I showed you that picture of his whole family. What a mess. You think you come from a messed up family. Maybe you do. But so did Jacob. And God was still at work in his life. God can work in whatever mess you've made or whatever mess you come from. I mean, that's a simple thing to take from this story. How about this? God's blessing on your life does not equal an absence of hardships. What do you mean? God came to Jacob. He blessed him. And then what happened? 20 years of hardship. 20 years. And so you thought that because your life was hard, God wasn't with you. And this narrative would come and say, no, early on we learn about this God who can bless people and they can still have a hard life, who can be with people and your life is still difficult. God's blessing and favor over you is not connected to how hard your life has been. How about this idea? And you have to know a little bit more Bible to get this one, and so I'll try to fill in the blanks here, but the story of which you are a part, the story that you are participating in is so much bigger than you will ever get to see. And what you're doing in the story, you may never know the ramifications of that or how God is going to use those contributions. God comes to this family and he says, I will make you into a great nation. That nation will become known as the nation of Israel that has 12 tribes in it. 12 tribes that will be named after the 12 sons that Jacob has. We learned about 11 today. There's a last one that comes, Benoni, that we won't get to, but he has 12. And the tribes are named after that. 6 of the tribes of Israel come from Leah. One of those tribes is the tribe through which King David will come and Jesus will come. Which tribe is Jesus from? He's from the tribe Judah. He's the Lion of Judah. Who is Judah's mom? Leah. And so you get God telling a story in which one day we'll be able to look back and trace the lineage of Jesus, the hope of the world. And at some point back through the lineage, we'll see a pairing of two people. Jacob, the younger, the weaker, the trickster, the rebel. Paired up with who? Leah, the unloved. Isn't that cool? That God would pick those two. And it makes sense when you see that when Jesus would walk the earth and begin to proclaim the good news of the kingdom, that who did he target? The lower, the lowly, the poor, the sinners, the tricksters, the rebels, the unloved. All the time that Leah spent wishing that her husband would love her, wishing that God would see her, that God would maybe do something in her life. What a crazy thought that would be for her in her time. And God was like, you will give birth to Judah. And through Judah will come the hope of the world. The story that you are participating in may be so much bigger than you ever get to see. But it doesn't mean God's not there. Using you, using your obedience, using your faithfulness, and even able to work in the messes that you make. And lastly, let me give you one last idea from this story. And it's the descriptions that we're given of God. They're very sparse in these 3 chapters. But we find words like this used. That when Leah was unloved, that God sees her. And that when Leah could no longer give birth to sons, that God hears her. And that when Rachel was probably at the end of her rope and had yet to give birth to a son, God remembers her. And when Jacob is asleep one night, God comes to him in a dream and God says to him, I am with you. And I have seen everything that you've been through the last 20 years. This God, who we know so little about, and we're learning who he is, chooses to reveal himself as a God who sees and hears and remembers and is with us. In Genesis chapter 16, which comes before all of this, a slave girl named Hagar is the first one to name God. This God that we are learning about in the pages of the first book of the Bible. Who is he? What should we call him? The first thing we're going to call him? The God who sees me. That's what the Bible wants you to first learn about this God. He's a God that sees me. And this story adds to it, and he hears you, and he will remember you, and he is with you. And so maybe this is a story for anybody that's had a hard life. For anybody who's lived what they feel like is half a life. Like half of it's good and half of it's not so good. Like Leah could have children, but her husband didn't love her. And Rachel had the love of her husband, but she couldn't have children. And Jacob is building a big nation, is forming around him, and yet he would love to go back home. It feels like I just am having half a life. Maybe it's a story for you that God is still with you in that. For anybody that feels like they have been abandoned by God, that have lived a life where they are unloved, where they have been oppressed. For anybody who knows what it feels like to have thought it's just going to be a few days. And those days turn into decades. I thought this rough patch in my marriage was going to be a few days, and it's turned into decades. I thought I'd pray for my children for a couple days and it would get better, but it's gotten worse and it's been decades. I thought my job would get better. I didn't think I would always be this low on the totem pole. I thought it'd be a couple days, maybe a year, and it's been decades. Maybe this is a story for those people, for us, as an invitation to trust in the God who will become the God of Jacob, whose promises never fail, and who he gently makes them come to pass. The God who holds the future. Mysteriously, the future belongs to this God. Whether you are actively participating or not, the future belongs to him. Can I ask you to close your eyes, and I want to just put a thought in your mind as we close. The thought comes from a man named Anthony DeMello. He has these beautiful words: behold God beholding you and smiling. Behold God beholding you and he's smiling. The God who sees you. The God who hears you. The God who remembers you. The God who is with you in this moment. Can you see him looking at you and he's smiling? God, help us to trust that that is true. And that because of the full revelation of Jesus, who reveals the unbelievable love that you have for us, that we can bank on it, that you see us, that you are with us, that you love us more than we could imagine, and that you have good plans for us, even if those plans are not our plans. Help us to trust you in the power of your Spirit. Pray in your strong resurrected name. Amen.